most feared gunman in the West watched a woman get kidnapped and did absolutely nothing. At least, that's what everyone thought. For 9 years, Roan Calloway had buried the deadly legend known as gospel. When a brave schoolteacher carrying the hopes of 31 stolen families falls into the hands of ruthless outlaws, the past comes riding back for him. This story teaches us that the strongest people are not those who seek revenge, but those who choose integrity, redemption, and courage when it matters most. If you enjoy meaningful Western stories with unforgettable characters, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe for more.
He didn't move when they took her. Della Hartley screamed his name. It was the only name she had for him, Roan. And Roan Calloway sat on the wagon bench with his hands loose in his lap, his eyes down on the dirt road, like a man waiting on rain that wasn't coming. 7 rifles. She counted them later, but in that moment, she only felt them. 7 barrels catching the white Nebraska sun. Mason Pike already had his fist in her hair. "Easy now," Pike said, though he wasn't being easy. He dragged her sideways off the bench. Her shoulder hit the wheel hub, then the ground, and the wind went out of her in one hard cough. Dust filled her mouth. She came up swinging anyway. She'd been raised by a man who taught her that you always come up swinging. It didn't matter. Pike was twice her weight, and he'd done this before. She could tell there was no anger in him, just habit. "The coat," he said. "Let go of me." "The coat, ma'am." She had it folded over her arm. 8 months of work stitched into the lining. 31 names, written small and careful by people who were scared to say them out loud. She'd ridden 3 counties alone to gather them. She'd slept 4 hours in 4 days, protecting them. And she looked at Roan Calloway. And Roan Calloway was looking at the dirt. "Help me," she said. The words came out before she could stop them. She hated them the second they left her mouth. Small and begging, not how her father had raised her. But they came out anyway, because he was the one steady thing she thought she'd had, and he just sat there. One of the riders laughed. A young one, no more than 20. "Smart old man," the boy said. "Knows what ain't his to mine." Roan said nothing. He didn't even lift his head. Pike took the coat from her hand. She fought for it, clawed, tore a seam at the collar, but he peeled it off her arm the way you peel a saddle blanket off a tired horse. He shook it once, felt the weight in the lining, and he smiled. Slow, like a man who'd just been handed something better than money. "Well now," he said, "you did lie to me." Della stopped fighting, not because she gave up, because there was nothing left to grab. She stood there, in the road, with her shoulders screaming, and her breath ragged. And she did the only thing she had left. She straightened her back. She would not fold in front of these men. She would not give them that. She looked at Roan one more time. He was watching the road in front of the horses. His face showed nothing, not fear, not shame, not even the small flinch a man gives when something shameful happens beside him and he chooses to let it. Just nothing, like a stone that had decided a long time ago that it was a stone, and something in her broke clean in 2. She'd trusted Mattie Cole back at the boarding house. Mattie had pressed her hands together and said, "Take Roan. He's quiet. Nothing rattles him." Della had believed her. She'd believed a quiet man was a steady one. She'd been wrong about that, about a lot of things. 2 riders climbed down and tied her wrists. Not cruel, just quick. A length of rope, a knot she felt go tight, and she thought even then, even sick with it, "That's not a good knot. My father tied better." The thought arrived on its own. Her father's voice came with it, the way it always did when she was afraid. "A person's worth, Della. It isn't what other folks fear in him." She could see him saying it. At the kitchen table, a survey map spread out under his hand. "It's how he treats the ones who can't fight back." They put her up behind a rider. The horse shifted under the new weight. Pike folded her coat over his arm like it was his own, and he looked up at Roan Calloway on the wagon, almost kindly. "Old man," he said, "go on to town. Tell the sheriff if you've a mind to." He grinned. "He works for us anyhow." A rider slapped the side of the wagon as he passed. "Ride on. This ain't your concern." Roan said nothing. They turned east, toward the broken ridge they'd come from. Della did not cry. She'd promised herself that much. But as the wagon shrank behind the rocks, and the hoofbeats filled up the hot, still air. She felt something worse than fear settle into her chest. It was the weight of having believed in the wrong man. 8 months, her father's land, 31 names, and the man they'd called Steady had sat on a wagon bench and looked at the dirt while they carried all of it away. She did not know, could not have known, that she was wrong about that too. Because, back on the wagon, in the moment Pike's riders had first fanned across the trail, Roan Calloway had stopped looking at the dirt. He'd started counting. 7 rifles, 4 pistols showing, likely 2 more under coats. The horse on the far left favored its right rear loose shoe. It'd spook if a shot cracked near it. The rider behind the wagon sat angled to watch Roan, not the woman, which meant he was the one they'd told to kill the driver. If the driver became a problem. Roan counted all of it in the time it took Pike to swing down from his saddle. He hadn't moved because he was afraid. He'd moved enough men into the ground in his life to know the arithmetic. 7 guns pointed at a woman. Go off the instant the man beside her does something sudden. He'd learned that once, at a cost, he didn't take out and look at in daylight. He'd learned it well enough that it had become the thing under his skin. Watch first, move last. Never draw until you know where every bullet in the yard is going to land. The boy had called him smart. He wasn't smart. He was old in the way careful men get old. There's a difference. Roan waited until the last rider crested the ridge and dropped from sight. Then he climbed down, unhitched the faster of the 2 horses, slung his old Winchester across his back, stood a moment in the road, in the copper heat, looking east at the rocks where they'd taken her. Somewhere on the other side of that ridge, a woman with her wrists tied was telling herself nobody was coming. She was wrong. He started walking. The trail bent up through the rocks, and Roan Calloway followed it on foot, leading the horse instead of riding. A man on foot is quieter. A man on foot can stop. He stopped a lot. Every few hundred yards, he'd go still and listen, not for the riders. He knew where the riders were going, but for the land. A jay that quit calling. A horse blowing somewhere it shouldn't be. The small sounds that tell you when you're walking into something. He'd learned to listen like that a long time ago. He'd paid for the lesson. He didn't think about the price in daylight, if he could help it. The sun sat heavy on his neck. His shirt stuck to his back. He was 35 years old, and felt, some days, like he'd lived 2 lives already, and was halfway through borrowing a third. He thought about the woman. He thought about the look she'd given him from the road. Help me. He'd heard a lot of people say that word to him over the years. Most of them hadn't meant me, the man on the wagon. They'd meant somebody, anybody. Della Hartley had meant him. She'd looked right at him and meant him, and he had kept his eyes on the dirt and let her believe he was nothing. That was going to sit in him a while. He knew it, even now. But it had been the right call. And a man who trades the right call for a clean conscience is a man who gets people killed. So he'd looked at the dirt, and he'd counted. Here is what counting looks like when you've done it your whole life. You don't see a man. You see a problem and how it moves. Pike came off his horse left foot first, which meant his weight settled on his right, which meant if Roan had drawn in that half second, the first shot would have taken Pike before Pike's hand cleared leather. 1. But behind Pike there were 7 rifles, and 4 of them were already up, and 2 of those 4 were pointed at the woman, not at Roan, at her. That was the whole arithmetic, right there. A frightened man counts his own danger. Roan had stopped doing that years ago. He counted theirs, and he counted hers. And hers came out worse than his every time he ran it. 7 guns on a woman go off the moment the man beside her moved. He'd seen it happen. He'd been the man who moved once. He'd been fast, and he'd been right, and the boy beside the woman had still caught a bullet that wasn't meant for him, and the boy had been 8 years old. Roan stopped on the trail. He stood there a moment, with the horse breathing behind him, and the heat coming up off the rocks, and he let the memory walk through him, the way you let a bad horse walk a circle till it tires. Then he kept moving. The name had found him when he was 22. He hadn't gone looking for it. That was the thing people never understood. They heard gospel, and they pictured a man who'd wanted it. There'd been a fellow in a railroad town who liked hurting people. Not with lawyers, not with paper, with his hands. Because he was big and the town was scared, and the law had been scared for 3 years running. Roan hadn't been scared. He'd been young and stupid and quick, and he'd confused those last two for the same thing. So he stopped the man. And then he stopped the two who came to settle it. And then word got around that there was a fellow out west who could do that kind of stopping. And the men who needed that kind of stopping started finding him. And somewhere in there, a bartender heard a dying man whisper, "Gospel," like the last word you ever hear. It stuck the way bad names always stick, better than good ones ever do. By the time Roan was 25, it wasn't his anymore. It belonged to the territory. Gospel Calloway, like he was weather, like he was a thing that happened to people, instead of a man making choices. He'd made choices. That was the part nobody put in the stories. Some of them he'd carry into the ground, but they were his. He'd pick them up himself, one at a time, the way you pick up stones. And that mattered to him even when nothing else did. Then there was the day with the boy. He didn't say the boy's name, even now. Not out loud, not in his head. He kept it folded up somewhere he didn't open. After that, he rode to a town in the New Mexico territory, and he sat in a livery stable for 2 days, and on the third day, he buried the gun belt under the floor of an empty stall and walked out with nothing on his hip. He'd been gone from the name 9 years. 9 years of freight work, because freight work asked you nothing. 9 years of being quiet. He'd gotten old the way careful men get old. Not happy exactly, but whole. Most days, whole. And then a woman named Mattie Cole had looked at him across her boarding house kitchen and said, "Take the job, Roan." Mattie Cole had known who he was for 6 years. She'd never said it. She wasn't a woman who said things she didn't need to. But she'd known, and she'd sent a school teacher with a coat full of stolen names out onto a road where Cyrus Vane's men were waiting. And she'd handed that school teacher to him on purpose. Roan understood that now, walking up through the rocks. He hadn't understood it that morning. He'd thought it was freight. He should have known better. Mattie didn't do anything by accident. He came up over the last of the ridge near sundown and went down on his belly in the scrub. Below him, in a dry creek bed, sat a line shack, the kind of place built to be forgotten. One door, one window, a stovepipe gone to rust, a fire ring out front, horses on a picket line. He counted again, 7 horses, 6 men he could see one at the door. The rest loose around the fire, passing a bottle the way men do when they think the hard part's behind them. That left one unaccounted for, probably sent back to the trail to watch the road, or sent ahead to carry word to Vane. The 7th horse, though, told him something else. It was a good horse, too good for an outlaw. Clean tack, a town saddle. Somebody had ridden out here who didn't usually sit a saddle, a lawyer, maybe, or a man who sent lawyers. That was new. That meant the job had grown teeth since this morning. Roan lay in the scrub and watched the light go from copper to amber to a deep bruised purple, and he did the patient arithmetic of a man who has learned the hard way that the difference between a rescue and a funeral is usually about 90 seconds of watching you didn't want to do. The young guard at the door kept checking the window. Then the dark, then the window again. Nervous, green. Not enough years on him to hide it yet. Roan filed that away. The green ones could go either way. Sometimes they shot from fear. And sometimes, if you gave them the right thing to hold, instead, they were the first ones to set the gun down. He thought about the woman inside. She'd held her back straight while they tied her wrists. He'd seen that from the wagon. Most people fold when the rope goes on. She'd straightened up instead, like she'd decided these men weren't going to get to watch her come apart. That was a particular kind of person. He'd known a few, not many. The dark came down full. The fire threw long shadows up the creek bank. Roan eased back from the rim, slow as smoke, and began to work his way around toward the back of the shack, where the old sun-dried planks had been nailed up by somebody in a hurry a long time ago. He went without a sound. Somewhere on the other side of that wall, a woman with her wrists tied was telling herself nobody was coming for her. He meant to fix that. Della had stopped pulling against the rope 20 minutes ago. Not because she'd quit, because she understood rope. Her father had taught her to tie a proper knot when she was 8. Sit still, Della. Watch my hand. She'd hated it then. She blessed him for it now. She'd spent the whole walk from the horses to the shack, feeling every inch of what held her wrists. And what held her wrists was a competent knot, not a good one. There was a difference. And she was already living in the difference, working it a quarter inch at a time against the rough edge of a floorboard, while the boy by the door watched everything but her hand. The boy's name was Webb. She'd gotten that much. 20, maybe. A beard, he was still losing the argument. Eyes that never stopped moving door, window door, which was nerves. Not skill. She filed it away the way she filed everything. Her father had taught her that, too. A woman who pays attention, Della, is never as helpless as folks think she is. She leaned her head back against the wall and made herself breathe slow. You've been riding with Pike long, she said. Webb's eyes snapped to her. Don't. Don't what? That thing. Where you talk at a person till they feel like they know you. He shifted his grip on the rifle. Don't. She almost smiled. He was smarter than he looked. Most of them weren't. All right, she said. Then I won't talk at you. I'll just tell you something true. And you can do with it what you want. He didn't answer, but he didn't tell her to stop either. So she went on, even and quiet, the way you'd read off a list. Those papers Pike took off me. You know what's in them. Ain't my business. They're proof, she said. Proof that the man who hired your boss stole land from 31 family. Widows. Folks just off the wagon train. A man who left an arm at Shiloh. People who started with nothing and got talked out of the little they'd built with forged paper and a sheriff who looks the other way. Webb's jaw worked. Why are you telling me this? Because you asked me not to talk at you, she said, and I respected that. So I'm telling you what's so. Instead, when this is done, when your boss gets paid and rides off, those 31 families don't get their land back. They just stay broke. And somebody had to stand in this shack and decide that was fine. She let it sit. That's all, she said. I'm not asking you for anything. Webb looked at her a long moment. Then he turned back to the window, and he didn't say one word. And that was fine. She hadn't really been talking to Webb. She'd been talking to herself, reminding herself what was real, what it was for. Why a woman with bruised wrists in a dead man's shack was still underneath the fear, exactly where she meant to be. She went back to the rope. The quarter inch had become a half. She was so deep in the work that she almost missed it. A single footstep outside, behind the shack, not in front. Wrong weight, wrong rhythm, not any of the men she'd been listening to for 2 hours. She went still. Webb was watching the door. Then, from the other side of the back wall, low enough that it barely reached her, a voice. A voice that had said maybe 11 words to her in 3 days, and that she knew anyway. Instantly, the way you know your own name called across a noisy room. Don't make a sound, Roan Calloway said through the wall, and get away from that corner. Della's heart did something complicated. She looked at Webb. His back was still to her. She shifted her weight and slid, slow and silent, away from the corner and toward the middle of the floor. 3 seconds later, the plank she'd been leaning on came free. No crash, no drama. Just one board, persuaded loose from the outside by somebody who knew the right angle and had the patience to find it. A gap open, narrow, dark, just wide enough. She didn't think. She moved. Hey, Webb turned. Roan's arm came through the gap, caught her bound wrists, and pulled. Webb lunged. Too late. Della was already through, scraping her bad shoulder on the edge of the plank, and then the night air hit her face, and a hand closed on her arm, and a low voice said, "Plain as anything, can you run?" "Yes." "Then run." She ran. He was beside her, not ahead, not dragging beside, matching her stride, steering them on a diagonal that kept the shack between them and the firelight. Behind them, Webb was shouting. Boots hit the dirt. Voices came up all at once, confused, spreading the wrong way. Left, Roan said. She cut left without asking. Down. She dropped flat behind a shelf of rock, and he came down beside her, and they stood there with their faces in the still warm dirt, while the shouting fanned out into the dark. He had a knife out already, one cut, clean, and the rope fell off her wrist. She brought her hands to her chest, and felt the blood come stinging back into her fingers. "The papers," she whispered. "Pike has I know. We have to I know that too." She turned and looked at him. His hat was gone somewhere. His face was the same as it always was, still giving nothing. But his eyes were different now, not in the wagon seat way. Something older was in them. The look of a man staring at a problem he'd solved before, at a cost, and doing the arithmetic on whether the cost would be the same this time. And all the fury she'd been carrying since the road came back up her throat at once. "You sat there," she said, low, shaking, "on the wagon. You sat there and stared at the dirt and, and let them put a rope on me." "I did. They could have." "They had 7 rifles on you," Roan said, 4 of them up, 2 pointed at your head. "Not mine." His voice didn't rise. It just laid the thing down flat between them. "I move, you die." "That's not me being careful, Mrs. Hartley." That's the only true sentence there was to say at that moment. She stared at him. "I wasn't looking at the dirt," he said. "I was counting." And something in the way he said it, not defending himself, just telling her the way you'd tell a child a hard fact, because lying would be worse, made the fury go out of her all at once and leave her shaking and tired in the dark. "I trusted you," she said. It came out smaller than she meant. "I know. Maddie said you were steady." "I am steady," Roan said. "Steady's not the same as quick. Folks always want them to be the same thing." He looked back toward the shack. "Quick is what got people killed. Steady is what's about to get your papers back." Della pressed her palm against the dirt and made herself breathe. "Those papers," she said, "aren't mine." He glanced at her. "That's what I need you to understand. If this goes wrong, and you're sitting here deciding whether it was worth it." She turned her bruised wrists over, looked at them, looked back at him. "That land doesn't belong to me. It belongs to a German widow who buried 2 children crossing the plain, to a family that walked up out of the South with everything they owned in one cart, to an old man holding ground his people held before this was a territory, to a soldier who came home with one arm and got told his claim wasn't valid because he couldn't work it fast enough." Her voice was steady now, not pleading, telling. "The law is supposed to hold the same for all of them as it does for Cyrus Vane. The same as it would for you or for me. That's the whole idea. That's the only idea." She swallowed. "And the day it stops being true for the weakest person on that list, it's already stopped being true for everybody. It just takes the strong ones longer to notice." Rowan was quiet a moment. In the dark, she couldn't read his face, but she felt the quality of his silence change the way a room changes when somebody opens a window. Nothing you could point to, just a shift in the air. "Your father teach you that," he said. She blinked. "Yes. How'd you?" "You talk like a person who's repeating somebody they loved." He said it, without softness and without mockery, just noticing. "Most folks, when they say a true thing, they say it like it's theirs. You say it like you're carrying it for somebody who can't anymore." Della looked at him for a long moment. "He's dead," she said. "Vane's the reason, I figured." Behind them, the shouts had started to organize. Men quit running blind and began to think. A voice that had to be Pike's cut across the others, low and hard. And the searching changed shape slower, now smarter, fanning along the creek. Roan rose into a crouch, slow as the smoke off a snuffed candle. "They'll have a man on the horses inside 2 minutes," he said. "We've got that long to be somewhere they're not." He held out his hand. She looked at it, the scarred knuckles, the steadiness of it, and she thought about her father at the kitchen table and the 31 names against her skin that weren't there anymore, and the long odds. And she took it. "All right," she said. "What's the plan?" Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile, the distant cousin of one. "First," Roan said, "we don't die in this creek bed. Then I'll tell you the rest." They didn't die in the creek bed. It came close. Twice a rider passed near enough that Della could hear the horse breathing. Near enough she stopped breathing herself. But Roan had a way of going so still. He stopped being a man and started being a shadow that had wandered somewhere. Shadows don't belong. She lay beside him and learned how to disappear by watching him do it. By the time the moon was up, the search had pulled back toward the shack. Searching men make noise. Tired men go quiet and wait. The tired part was good for her and Roan. They used it. There was a horse at the bottom of the creek bed. Picked it apart from the rest. Roan got to it the way he got everywhere slow, then all at once. He cut the line, walked the horse 100 yards over soft ground before he let it make a sound. And then he put Della up and swung on behind her, and they rode. She held the saddle horn. He held the reins around her. Neither of them said anything for a long while. "The papers," she said finally. "Pike's got them. He's got copy." She felt him go still behind her. Not stop, they kept riding, but a stillness came into him. "The listening kind." "Say that again," he said. "What Pike pulled out of my coat were copies. Good one, word for word, but copy." She watched the dark country slide by. "The originals are filed. Land office in Cheyenne, 8 weeks back. Sworn, stamped on the record. I did that before I ever rode for Casper Wells." For a moment, the only sound was the horse. "You let him think he'd won," Roan said. "I let him think he'd won." "Why?" "Because a man who thinks he's already taken the only copy gets careless. And a man who finds out he's wrong, in front of a federal judge, with his own handwriting on a receipt, that man's got nowhere left to stand." She turned her head a little. "My father taught me that. You don't fight the strong where they're strong. You wait for the one place they forgot to look." Behind her, Rowan was quiet in a new way. It was the quiet of a man revising something. She'd felt men do the opposite. Her whole life look at her, decide what she was, and never look again. This was the first time in a long while she'd felt a man look twice. "You've been doing this 8 months, he said. "Alone." "Yes, and nobody pointed you at it. Nobody set it up for you." "No," she said. "Folks keep wanting that to be true. A man behind me somewhere. It bothers them more than the stealing does." He didn't answer that, but she felt the window open again, the shift in the air. They rode into Casper Wells just as the sky went gray. Caleb Burke had a face like a man who'd given up being surprised around the time most men give up being young. He was a federal marshal, and he'd ridden up from Rawlins 3 days back on business he didn't explain, and when Roan came through his door at dawn with a bruised, sleepless woman beside him, Burke looked at the two of them for a long moment, and then he set down his coffee. "Roan," he said. "Caleb, that was the whole reunion. 2 men who'd done hard things together once, and didn't need to dress it up." Burke heard the story standing. He didn't interrupt. When Della laid the filed copies business out for him, the originals in Cheyenne, the assessor's report already on record, something moved behind his eyes that was almost respect and almost grief, like a man glad of a good card and sorry it had to be played at all. "That's a strong piece of work," he said. "Stronger than most lawyers would have managed." "Thank you," Della said. "It's also," Burke said, "not going to be enough by itself. And I'd rather you hear that from me, sitting down." She sat. Burke pulled a chair around and sat across from her, forearms on his knees, the way a man sits when he's about to tell you something he wishes weren't so. "Here's where you stand, Mrs. Hartley. You've got a contested claim, your father's land, that Vane's holding under a forged survey. To fight that, somebody has to hold the claim, stand on it, put their name on the suit, and answer for it in court." He paused. "And the territory doesn't much like letting a woman do that on her own. A married woman's property runs through her husband. A widow's got a little more room, but not much, and a widow fighting a man like Vane." He shook his head. "His lawyers will spend the whole trial arguing you don't have standing to be in the room. They won't argue the forgery. They'll argue you. And half the time, with the judges we've got, that works." Della was very still. "Say it plain," she said. "Plain," Burke said. "As things sit, the strongest evidence in the territory is being carried by the one person the law's most willing to ignore." The room was quiet. Della looked down at her hand. The wrists still showed the rope. She turned them over slow, the way you turn over a thing you already know the shape of. "I read a deed," she said. "Better than half the men in this county. I found the forgery they all missed. I rode 3 counties alone and built a case a lawyer couldn't, and I did it while I was scared every single mile." Her voice didn't rise. It just got very even. "And the law looks at all that, and the first thing it asks isn't, is she right? It's whose name does she answer?" "Yes," Burke said. "No softening, just the truth, handed over flat, the way Roan handed things over." "That's not justice," Della said. "That's a wall. Somebody built it on purpose and called it the natural order. and I am tired down to my bones of being asked to respect it. She looked up, but I'll climb it if I have to. Tell me what climbing it costs. Burke glanced at Roan. Roan had been standing by the window the whole time, saying nothing, which was his way. Now he looked back at Burke, and something passed between the two men, the wordless arithmetic, of people who've solved hard problems together and remember how the work divides. There's a short road, Burke said. Careful, you won't like it. I don't much like offer it. A married woman fighting through her husband has standing. The court can't easily strip. If you were married to a man willing to put his name on the claim and let you run it, Vane Ains lawyers lose their best trick. They'd have to fight the forgery, and the forgery's where they lose. The room held its breath. Della looked at Roan. Roan looked at the window. You're talking about a marriage on paper, she said. I'm talking about a tool, Burke said, same as the deed's a tool. Nobody has to mean anything by it. It just has to be real enough to hold up. Della laughed once. There wasn't much humor in it. So that's the cure, she said. The law won't let me speak. So I borrow a man's name. And then suddenly, the same words coming out of the same mouth are allowed. She shook her head slowly. You hear how that sounds, Marshal? I do, Burke said. I've heard how a lot of it sounds. This job doesn't change what's true today, in this territory, in front of these judges. I can spend 10 years helping push that wall down. I can't push it down before your hearing in 3 weeks. Della was quiet a long moment. Then she turned to the man at the window. Mr. Calloway, she said, I'm sorry to do this to you. You hired on to drive a wagon. Roan turned from the window. He looked at her for a while. Not at the problem, at her. The straight back, the bruised wrists she kept turning over, the flat, tired, unbroken way she'd said, I'll climb it if I have to. My name's already a hard thing to carry, he said. I put it down 9 years ago for a reason. A pause, but it's mine. And if it'll hold a door open long enough for 31 families to walk through, that's a better use than it's had in a long time. Della blinked. That's a yes. It's an observation, Roan said, about a name. And for the first time since the road, since the rope, since the dirt, something in her chest came loose. Not happiness. She was too tired for happiness, but the absence of a weight she'd been carrying alone. So long she'd forgotten. It was a weight. All right, she said softly. Then we get married, Mr. Calloway. Roan. She tried it. It fit stranger in her mouth than she expected, and not badly. Della. He nodded once. Outside, Casper Wells was waking up. A dog, a door, a boy, driving a milk cow down the middle of the street, the whole town indifferent and ordinary and entirely unaware that two people had just agreed to lie to the law in order to make the law tell the truth. The land along the Platte that Vane hadn't swallowed yet sat in a loose string of homesteads, and the people on them had learned to live the way people live when the law is something that happens to other folks. They were careful, they were watchful, and they had each other, which it turned out was the only thing that had kept any of them on their ground at all. Roan spent a week among them, while Burke worked the legal end, and the hearing crept closer. He was no good at sitting still in a town. He'd never learned it. So he made himself useful, which was the only kind of talking he was ever really good at. He mended fence for old Tomas Reyes, whose family had held their ground since before it was a territory. At all, back when the paper that gave it to them was written in another language and signed by another country. Tomas walked the line with him, slow, his hands behind his back. My grandfather built this, Tomas said. Vane's lawyer told me the grant don't count, said the country that made it don't exist no more. So the paper don't either, he spat, as if a man's home stops being his home when the flag over the courthouse changes. What'd you tell him? Roan said, setting a post. I told him the land knew my family before it knew his country. Tomas watched Ron tamp the dirt. He didn't have an answer for that. Lawyers never do, for the true thing. Roan worked the post till it stood like it had grown there. Alone, a fence rail snaps, Tomas said, watching him. You lean a whole stack of them together. They hold up a roof. That's the only secret we got out here. We lean. He spent an afternoon with Cap Doyle, who'd left an arm at a battle he didn't like to name and come west to a claim the territory kept threatening to void because a one-armed man, they said, couldn't work the ground fast enough to earn it. Doyle was trying to set a trap line and losing the argument with the spring. Used to be, I could do this in the dark, Doyle said bitter. Two-hand. Now I'm half a man with half a claim. Roan crouched down beside him. Show me the trap, he said. He didn't take it from Doyle. He showed him a way to brace the spring against your knee. Anchor it with a boot heel. Use the one hand for the part that needed a hand and the body for the rest. It took 3 tries. On the 4th, the trap set clean. Doyle stared at it. People look at you, Roan said, standing, and they count what you're missing. The arm. Add it up. Decide what you can't do. He brushed the dirt off his knee. I don't count that way. Never had the luxury. I count what a man'll still do when the day goes bad. That's the only number that ever told me the truth about anybody. Doyle didn't say anything for a moment. He looked at the trap he'd set with one hand. Where'd you learn to think like that? He said. Hard place, Roan said. Wouldn't recommend the school. He sat one evening with Greta Brandt, a German widow who'd buried 2 children on the trail out and came the rest of the way alone, and who talked English in careful, hard-won pieces, like a woman laying stones across a creek. They think because I speak slow, I think slow, she said. The lawyer, the sheriff, they talk loud at me, like loud is the same as clear. She poured Roan coffee with a steady hand. I crossed an ocean and half a country and buried my babies in the ground and kept walking. I am not slow. I am only new to your words. You're not slow, Roan said. No, Greta agreed. I am not, she said. It costs them nothing to listen to a person like they matter, and still they will not pay it. Why is that, you think? Roan turned the coffee cup in his hand. Because the day you start listening to somebody, he said, is the day you can't pretend anymore. They're less than you. Some men would rather keep the pretending. It's cheaper to them than being fair. Greta looked at him a long time. You talk slow too, she said, but not because you are new to the words. No, ma'am, because you mean them. She nodded, satisfied. Good. There are not so many. Della watched all of it. She hadn't meant. She kept finding reasons to be where he was checking a document with Tomas, bringing water to the fence line. She told herself it was the case. It wasn't only the case. She watched a man the whole territory was supposed to fear get down in the dirt to set a one-armed man's trap. She watched him listen to a widow. Like her slow words were worth waiting for. And she thought about the road and the dirt he'd stared at, and how sure she'd been that day that she knew exactly what kind of nothing he was. She'd been wrong about a lot of things. At the well, late he was drawing water, and she came to help, and their hands met on the rope, and neither of them moved for a second longer than the work required. You're not what they say you are, she said. I'm exactly what they say I am, Roan said. That's the trouble. He let go of the rope. I'm just trying to be something else on top of it. It went bad on the 6th day, the way Vane liked to remind people things could. 4 riders came down the river road in the gold light, and Della knew the lead one by his hat. He'd been at the shack. They rode in slow, the way men ride when the point is the riding, and they pulled up in the middle of the Freeman's yard, where Amos and Hattie had a half-built barn going up board by borrowed. Mr. Vane wanted to send his regards, the lead one said, and remind folks that fighting him in court tends to be unhealthy. Houses burn, barns, sometimes more than barn. He let his horse step toward Hattie Freeman. He didn't get the second step. Nobody quite saw how Roan crossed the yard. One moment he was by the half-built wall. The next he was at the lead rider's stirrup, and his hand closed over the man's gun hand. Before he knew his gun was the thing in danger, and Roan took the pistol out of the holster, slow, almost gentle, the way you'd take a dangerous thing from a child, and stepped back with it. The second rider went for his. Roan was already there. He didn't draw. He didn't need to. He had the first man's pistol in his hand, and he simply turned, unhurried, and the second man looked down the barrel of his own friend's gun and decided, in the space of a breath, to keep his hand where it was. The yard had gone dead silent. You're going to ride back, Roan said, and tell Cyrus Vane that the people on this river have somebody standing with them now. His voice never lifted. And you're going to remember that I gave this gun back instead of using it. Remember that part special, because the day I decide it's the right reason. That's a different day. And you don't want to see it. He flipped the pistol, caught it by the barrel, and handed it back butt first. The rider took it with a hand that wasn't steady. They rode off slower than they came. And in the quiet that followed, Della saw something she filed away and didn't understand till much later. Amos Freeman wasn't watching the riders go. He was watching Roan, staring at him, at the set of his shoulders, at his hands, with a look on his face that wasn't relief at all. It was the look of a man who'd just seen a ghost cross his yard. But the moment passed, and the riders were gone, and the barn still needed building. So the families did what they always did. They picked up the borrowed boards. They leaned the rails together. And by dark, the wall that the riders had come to threaten stood a full foot higher than it had that morning because, as Tomas said, handing Roan a hammer, alone a thing snaps, but together it holds. Amos Freeman didn't say anything that night. He helped finish the wall. He thanked in Roan, quiet, and shook his hand, and his face had gone back to ordinary by the time the lanterns came out. But Della had seen it, that first look, and she knew the difference between a man who's let a thing go and a man who's put it away to deal with later. Amos had put it away. He came for it. 3 days on, at first light, when Roan was alone behind the Freeman place splitting rails, Della was there too, sitting on the woodpile with a stack of the family statements, reading them over the way her father had taught her slow, twice, looking for the weak seam Vane's lawyers would reach for. Amos crossed the yard with a cup of coffee he didn't drink. "You from down around the Cimarron, ever," he said. "Years back." Roan set the axe down. He didn't answer right away. Della looked up from her paper. Something in the quality of the quiet had changed, the way the air changes before weather. "I've been a lot of places," Roan said. "That ain't what I asked." Roan looked at, and Della watched a thing happen on Roan's face that she'd never seen there, not in the creek bed, not in the yard with the riders, a kind of bracing, like a man who hears a door open behind him and knows, without turning, who's come through it. "Yes," Roan said. "I was down around the Cimarron, years back." Amos nodded slow. "There was a man worked that country then," he said. "Worked for the cattle outfit, the ones buying up the little places, running folks off. They'd hire it done, and when the doing went hard, they'd send him." He turned the coffee cup in his hand and didn't drink it. "They called him Gospel." Della went very still on the woodpile. "Amos," Roan said. "My boy was 8 years old," Amos said. And the yard got so quiet, Della could hear the river. "We had 40 acres, Amos said. His voice didn't rise. "It was worse than if it had. It was even and careful the way you carry something you can't set down. Bought honest, paid on it. The outfit wanted it for water rights. They came at night to scare us off, and my Eli, my boy, he got scared, and he ran where a child runs, toward the noise instead of away, looking for his daddy. And there was shooting, and a lamp went over. And by the time the fire was through, I had 40 acres of black ground and one less a child than I'd had at supper." He looked at Roan. "I never knew which gun," he said. "Never knew whose bullet, whose lamp. Long time I told myself it didn't matter. The not knowing. Told myself a man can't hate a whole night." He set the coffee down on the chopping block, untouched. "Then 3 days ago, I watched you take a pistol off a man like you'd done it 1,000 times. And I knew the way you stand. I knew it from that night. I've been carrying your shoulders in my head for 11 years and never had a face to hang on. Now I do." Roan didn't look away. That was the thing Della would remember. He didn't look at the ground, didn't flinch, didn't reach for the 1,000 things a man reaches. He stood in the yard and let Amos Freeman look at him. And he took it the way you take a thing you've got coming. "I was there," Roan said. The words landed like stones in a well. "I was one of the men they sent that night. I won't tell you it was my bullet, because I don't know. And I won't hand you a lie to make either of us feel better. But I was there. I rode for the outfit that wanted your water, and whether I fired the shot or not. I was part of the reason your boy ran toward the noise." His voice stayed level, but something underneath it had cracked. I've carried that for 11 years, too. I just had the luck of not knowing your face to hang it on. You didn't get that luck. I'm sorry for. That's not enough. I know it's not. But I won't dress it up smaller than it is either. Amos stared at him. You ran, Amos said. After, they say gospel just stopped, disappeared. I buried my gun belt in New Mexico, and I never picked it up again. Rowan said. That night's the reason. I'd like to tell you I quit because I found something better in myself. The truth is, I quit because of your son. I never said his name. I didn't know it till just now. He swallowed. Eli. Amos's face came apart, just for a second, then knit back. It was Hattie, who came out then. She'd been listening from the doorway. Della understood that later, and she came across the yard slow, and she stood beside her husband, and she looked at Roan Calloway for a long, long time. You're him? She said. Yes, ma'am. Hattie Freeman was a small woman with iron in her. She'd buried a child and crossed half a country and built a life out of borrowed boards, and she stood in her own yard and looked at one of the men who'd burned the first one down. Della braced for the scream, the curse, whatever was coming. She thought she'd have screamed. I have hated you for 11 years, Hattie said. A man with no face. I hated the dark you came out of. I hated every night I couldn't sleep for it. Her voice shook, then steadied. And I want you to know, I'm not going to do it anymore. Roan didn't move. Not for your sake, Hattie said. Get that clear. I'm not handing you peace. You don't get to feel light because of anything I say this morning. She took a breath. I'm doing it for me, because hate took my Eli once in that fire, and I have let it come back every night since. And take a little more of me, a little more of my sleep, my joy, my husband's wife for 11 years, and I am done feeding it my life. It already ate my son. It does not get the rest of me. She was crying now, openly, and not wiping it away. Forgiving you doesn't mean it didn't happen, she said. It doesn't make you clean. It doesn't bring my boy back from that ground. I want you to understand exactly how much it does not do. Her chin came up. It only does one thing. It cuts the rope between your sin and my soul, so that what you did stops dragging me down into it too. That rope's been around my neck for 11 years. I'm taking it off. That's all. That's everything. The yard was silent. And Roan Calloway, the feared gunman in the West, the man who'd stared down 7 rifles without his pulse changing, stood in a poor family's yard and wept. Not loud. He didn't fall apart. The tears just came, and he let them. And he didn't hide his face, because hiding it would have been one more thing taken from these people who'd had so much taken already. Thank you, he said. It came rough. I don't deserve it. I know that's the whole point of it. It is, Hattie said. Now you carry it right. You hear me? Don't you waste what it cost me. Later, when the Freemans had gone in, Della found Roan at the woodpile. He hadn't picked the axe back up. He was just standing there in the early light. She didn't touch him. She just stood close. Vane, she said quietly. The outfit on the Cimarron. That was Vane's, wasn't it? Roan let out a long breath. Cyrus Vane bought that country, one burned-out family at a time, he said. I was the match he struck when paper didn't move folks fast enough. He looked at his own hands. He made me into gospel, Della. I gave him the years, but he's the one who pointed me. And I rode away, thinking I'd left him behind. And now he's stealing land along the Platte, Della said slowly, the same way. And I came riding into it carrying paper. And Mattie Cole, who knew exactly who you were, put us on the same road. Rowan looked at her. It was never just freight, he said. No, she said. I don't think it ever was. She watched the understanding settle into him that the man who'd made him and the man he'd spent 9 years running from being were the same man, and that the whole shape of this thing had been bending him back toward Vane from the turn of the wheel. You could run, she said, honestly, giving him the door. This isn't your fight to bleed for. You could put me on a horse to Cheyenne and ride the other way. Roan was quiet a moment. A long time ago, he said, I let Cyrus Vane decide who I was. I've spent 9 years trying to take that decision back from him. He looked east toward where the man's ranch sat past the broken country. I'm not handing it to him again. Not the running, not any of it. This time I pick. Vane didn't wait for the hearing. A patient man waits. Della had learned that from studying him. But patient isn't the same as slow. And a patient man who senses the ground moving will move first, hard, to remind everyone whose ground it is. He came at them on a Thursday with fire. The first they knew was the smell wood smoke, where there shouldn't be any. Then the orange glow off the low clouds to the south, Cap Doyle's place. By the time the River families got there, with buckets and wet blankets, the cabin was a black skeleton, and Doyle was sitting in the dirt with blood down the side of his face, holding his one arm across his chest where they'd cracked something when he wouldn't stop swinging. 4 of them, he got out, said it weren't even about me, said it was a message for the schoolteacher. He looked up at Della, and there was no blame in it, which was worse than blame. Tell her the papers cost more than she thinks. Della stood in the firelight and felt the whole thing tip toward her. She'd carried it the whole time like it was hers to carry. The risk, the cost. But cost has a way of spreading to the people standing nearest you, whether you mean it to or not, and Cap Doyle was bleeding in the dirt with the math of it written on his face. This is because of me, she said. No, Roan said. He was beside her. He'd come up without a sound, the way he did. It's because of Vane. Don't you take his sin and wear it like it's yours. That's a trick. The strong play on the decent they do the harm, and let the good people carry the guilt. Don't pick it up. She looked at him. Then what do I carry? The work, he said. Same as always. You carry the work, and you finish it. And that's how Cap gets a real cabin, and not just a memory of guilt won't build him a wall, finishing this will. They got Doyle to the Freemans. Hattie cleaned the cut and set the arm, and was good at both, the way women got good at things out here when the nearest doctor was a day's ride, and on the wrong man's payroll. It was the doctor that broke it open. Burke had ridden in by then. He'd seen the glow too, and he stood in the Freeman kitchen with his hat in his hands, and a look Della hadn't seen on him before. There's a thing you need to know, he said. I went digging after Cheyenne. Into your husband, Mrs. Hartley. Into John. The kitchen went still. My husband died of a fever, Della said. 3 years ago. There's nothing to dig into. That's what the record says, Burke said. Signed by the town doctor, Marcus Ellery. He turned his hat in his hands. Same doctor sits on Vane's bank board. Same doctor signed 3 other death certificates in this county. The same year, all of the men who'd filed claims Vane wanted. He looked at her, and his voice gentled in a way that frightened her more than anything. Your husband had filed on the river bottom, Della, the good bottom land. 2 weeks before he died, he'd told the land office he meant to fight Vane's survey. Della sat down. She didn't decide to. Her legs just did it. You're saying? I'm saying I don't think John Hartley died of a fever, Burke said. I think a man you trusted signed a paper that said he did. And I'm sorry. I've sat on it 2 days trying to find a kinder way to put it, and there isn't one. The room was quiet. Della looked at her hands on the table. 3 years. 3 years she'd carried John's death as a thing that simply happened. A cruelty of God or weather, the kind of loss you fold up and learn to live beside. And the whole time it had been a choice, a man's choice, a signature, a lie written down by someone who'd held her hand at the funeral and told her to be strong. She thought she'd known the shape of her grief. She'd had the wrong shape entirely. I trusted him, she said. Ellery. He came to the burying, he said. Her voice stopped working. She made it work. He said John went peaceful. That's the cruelest part of how Vane does it, Roan said quietly. He'd crouched down beside her chair. He doesn't just take. He takes, and then he gets the people you trust to tell you it was natural. So you grieve instead of fight. So you never even know there was a fight to be had. Della pressed her palms flat on the table and held very still. The way a person holds still when the floor they've stood on for years turns out to be a trapdoor. That night, she couldn't be in the house. She went out to the half-built barn and sat against the new wall, and after a while, Roan came and sat down a few feet off, not crowding her, just there. I keep doing sums, she said. If I'd known. If I'd looked harder, he was right there. Fighting Vane 2 weeks before, and I didn't even you were his wife, Roan said. Not his lawyer. You didn't know there was a forgery to find, because the men who made it spent good money making sure nobody would. That's not a thing you failed at. That's a thing they succeeded at. Different sentence entirely. She was quiet a while. How do you do it? She said finally. Carry a thing like Eli. 11 years, and still set a man's trap. Listen to a widow's slow words. How do you not just go hard all the way through? Roan was quiet long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer. For a long while, I did go hard all the way through, he said. That's what gospel was. A man who decided feeling things was a luxury he couldn't pay for. He looked out at the dark river. Then I buried that boy I never met. And I found out the hard way, the going hard doesn't make the weight lighter. It just makes you too numb to set it down. You carry it forever, and you stop being able to love anybody. Worst of both, you pay the whole price and get nothing back. He turned and looked at. What frightens me, he said, was never drawing a gun. I can draw a gun. What frightens me is drawing it for the wrong reason. Because I'm angry, or because somebody paid me, or because it's easier than sitting in the dark feeling the thing I'd rather not feel. He paused. This sitting here, feeling it, this is the harder thing. I do it anyway. That's the only trick I've got. Della looked at him for a long moment in the dark. Then she reached over and took his hand. He let her. His hand was steady, the way everything about him was steady, and she held it and felt something she hadn't let herself feel in 3 years. Not since a fever that wasn't a fever. Not since a man she trusted told her to be strong. They hurt me to scare me off, she said. Vain, he thinks I've got no one. That a widow's alone, and a woman's alone, and the people on this river are too poor and too scattered to matter. He thinks that, Roan agreed. He's wrong. He's wrong, Roan said. You've got a whole river. And it's a funny thing about the people the world throws away: a German widow, a one-armed soldier, a man holding ground under a dead country's paper, a family that walked up out of slavery. They learn to stand for each other in a way the comfortable never have to. Vane's never been thrown away in his life. He doesn't know what that builds in people. It's the one thing on this whole river he can't count. And it's the thing that's going to beat him. Della held his hand in the dark, and the new wall stood at her back, a foot higher than it had been, built by people who had nothing, and leaned it together anyway. And, for the first time since Burke had said the word murdered, she didn't feel like she was falling. She felt like she was standing on something. The letter came 2 days before the hearing, and it came in Vane's own hand. A boy brought it to the Freeman place at dusk. A town boy, scared, who wouldn't get off his horse. Burke took it, read it once, set it on the table where everyone could see, because he wasn't a man who hid things from the people they belonged to. It was short. Patient men write short. Vane knew about the marriage. He called it what it was: a paper trick, and said any judge could be made to see it that way. He knew Roan's name, the old one. He laid it out, plain gospel Calloway, on the witness stand, and every word Della Hartley swore to would carry the stink of a hired killer's wife. The 31 families would be a mob led by a murderer. That was the story Vane would tell, and Vane owned the men who decided which stories got believed. And there was a last line, the worst one, because it wasn't a threat. It was a courtesy. Have your people clear off the river by Sunday. I'd rather not send men out again, but I will. The kitchen was quiet a long time. He'll do it tonight. Or tomorrow, Roan said. The Sunday's a kindness he doesn't mean. He says Sunday, so you'll spend 3 days arguing instead of moving. Then we move, Amos said. Move where? Greta said. This is the where. There is no other. Della watched Roan. She'd been watching him since the letter hit the table, and she'd seen something come into his face that hadn't been there before: a flatness, a settling, the look of a man doing a kind of arithmetic he'd sworn off doing. He stood up. He went out to the dark yard. She followed. He was at the fence line, looking east, toward the broken country where Vane's ranch sat. You're thinking about riding out there, she said. I'm thinking about it. Alone. Tonight. Vane's a day's hard ride. I could be in his study before sunup. His voice was very even. One man quiet. Who knows how? He's got walls and hired guns. But walls and hired guns are built to stop an army. They're not built to stop one man who's done this before and doesn't much care if he comes back. He didn't look at. I ended at the source. No hearing. No name on a stand. No 3 more days for him to send fire. Just done. Della stood beside him in the dark. And the oath? She said. The oath's mine to break. It is, she said. That's true. It's yours. She kept her voice level, the way he kept his. 'Cause She had learned that the level voice was the one he could hear. And if you ride out there tonight and put a bullet in Cyrus Vane, in his own house, you'll save this river. I believe that. You probably would. Then, and you'd hand him the last thing he ever wanted from you, she said. You'd be gospel again. The thing he made. 9 years you spent taking that back from him, one quiet day at a time, and you'd give it all back in one night. For him, because he wrote you a clever letter. And you let it work. Roan said nothing. He doesn't just want the land, Roan. He's getting old. Men like him what they want, at the end, is to be proved right about people. He spent years believing a man is only ever what he can be used for. You proved him wrong by becoming somebody who sets a one-armed man's trap and weeps in a poor family's yard, right out there, and kill him in the dark. And his last thought is, I knew it. I knew that's all he ever was. She shook her head. Don't give him that. He's taken enough. The river ran in the dark. Somewhere a horse shifted on its picket. I didn't marry a gun, Della said. Quieter now. I know it started as a paper. I know what Burke called it. But somewhere between the creek bed and this fence, I stopped pretending. And I think you did too. I didn't fall in love with the fastest hand in the West. I fell in love with the man who counts what people can still do instead of what they're missing. Don't make me bury that man so the gun can ride out and win. Roan turned and looked at her. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. The flatness was still in his face. And then, slowly, it broke not into grief, into something else. Something younger than 35. Something that had been buried even longer than the gun belt. I'm scared of the stand, he admitted. It cost him to say it. She could hear the cost. I'm scared of every man in that room learning what I was. Riding out tonight. That's not me being brave. That's me being scared and calling it brave. I know, she said. Brave is the hearing. Brave is sitting in that chair and saying your own name and letting it cost you. You told me that. About the gun and the wrong reasons. You already know the answer. You just needed to hear it in somebody else's voice. He let out a breath that shook on the way out. All right, he said, the hearing. The hard way, she said. And then, because the dark was kind and they were both done being careful, she stepped in and kissed him the man, not the gun, and his arms came around her steady. As everything about him was steady, and the paper marriage stopped being paper. Somewhere out there, at the fence line, with the river running and the whole cast-off river country sleeping behind them. Inside later, Burke laid it out. The originals were filed. The assessor's report was on record since April. Pike's man had turned Mason Pike, himself had ridden in after dark, sat down across from Burke and started talking. Because, he said, a man at a line shack had once told him, sworn testimony was a thing he could choose. And he'd thought about it for 2 weeks and decided. The man was right. And Pike had brought the thing that changed everything. Vane's not just clearing witnesses, Pike said. He's clearing us, his own men. Anybody who was at that shack, anybody who knows how the paper got forged. He's got a rider named Cole bringing men down from the North Ranch tomorrow. And it ain't to scare school teachers. It's to make sure nobody who worked for him is left talking. When the Federals come, the room took that in. He's cleaning house, Burke said, which means we don't have 3 days. We have until tomorrow. Roan looked at Della. Then tomorrow, he said, we don't go to him. We make him come to town in daylight, in front of everybody, where a gun in the dark can't fix anything for him, where the only thing that works is the truth, said out loud, by people he spent his whole life betting would stay quiet. Vane came at dawn, the way Roan knew he would. A patient man pushed, stops being patient. And a man who has spent his life believing the world is a thing he owns, cannot stand to learn otherwise from a distance. He has to come see it for himself. He has to stand in the street and watch the small people. Remember, they're large. So Cyrus Vane rode into Casper Wells with 11 men at first light, and he found the town already awake. Word had gone up and down the river in the night. They'd come, all of them. Amos and Hattie Freeman. Tomas Reyes with his daughter Inez. Greta Brandt. Cap Doyle with his arm in a sling and his jaw set. 2 Hawks and 4 Pawnee men who'd lost their ground to the same forged ink. They stood along the boardwalk and in the street, unarmed, in their work clothes, in the gray light. And in front of them, in the middle of the street, stood Roan Calloway and Della Hartley. Vane reined up. He was a big man gone soft, and certain in a good coat, with a face built for rooms where other people stood when he came in. He looked at the crowd the way you'd look at livestock that had wandered. "It shouldn't. This is foolish," he said, mild, almost kind. "I've got 11 guns. You've got a street full of nobody." "You've got 11 guns," Roan agreed. "And every one of them belongs to a man you sent Cole to kill tonight." The street went still. Vane's men shifted. They'd heard something in the night. Some of them, a rumor. And now the man in the middle of the street was saying it out loud, flat, like a fact already known. "He's cleaning house," Roan said. And he wasn't talking to Vane now. He was talking to the men behind him. Anybody who was at the shack, anybody who forged the survey, or carried the orders. "He's not paying you off, boys. He's tying off loose ends." Pike already worked it out. "Ask yourselves why a careful man like Cyrus Vane brought every witness to his crimes into one street at one time. It's not to protect you." Don't listen to Vane started. But it was already moving through them. The cold arithmetic, the same sum Pike had run. A man here, a man there, easing his hand off his gun. "You walked into this," Roan said to Vane, "because you couldn't help it. You had to come see the small people be small one more time. And instead, you're going to watch them stand up. You spent your whole life betting they never would. You bet wrong. That's the only thing I came to tell you." Vane's face went dark. "Hargrove," he said to one of his men, a thin one near the front. Now the thin man drew. He didn't draw on Roan. He drew on Della. Because Vane, even now, even at the end, understood that the woman was the threat. The woman with the papers and the steady voice, and a patient man kills the threat. What happened next? Most of the street never fully saw. Roan drew once. There are men who say they saw it. They didn't. They heard the shot. And then that Roan Calloway's gun was in his hand and smoking, and that the thin man named Hargrove was sitting in the dust, holding a wrist that would never draw a gun again. His pistol, 6 feet away in the dirt. Between the draw and the done, there had been nothing a human eye could hold, just the shot, arriving before the motion, the way Della had heard it described once and never believed. Like weather, someone had said of him once, like a thing that happens to you. Now she'd seen it. And she'd seen the other thing, too, the thing that mattered more. He'd had every right to kill. The man was firing on his wife. And Roan Calloway had put a bullet through a gun hand instead of a heart in the half-second he had, while moving faster than thought. That was not luck. That was a choice made at a speed most men can't choose at. That was the whole of who he'd become, decided in less time than it takes to flinch. A second of Vane's men went for. From the boardwalk, Mason Pike's voice cracked out, "Don't," and Pike was there, gun drawn, standing with the river people. And the man thought back. Then it was quiet, except for Hargrove groaning in the dust. Roan walked toward Vane, not fast, slow, unhurried, the particular walk of a man who has already decided and is only covering the ground. He stopped close. His gun was down at his side now. Vane looked at it. Looked at him. "You could have killed me clean just now," Vane said. "Why didn't you? Your gospel. Killing's what I made you for." "I know it is," Roan said. "That's exactly why I won't." He let that sit. "You made me into a man who solved everything with the quick way. And I let you, because I was young, and I thought fast was the same as right. It took me 11 years and a dead boy named Eli to learn the difference. I'm not handing you the satisfaction of being wrong about me. You don't get to die thinking you were right about me." He holstered the gun. "You're going to live, Cyrus. You're going to stand in a federal court, and you're going to hear all 31 names you stole read out loud, one at a time, to your face by the people you bet would never speak. That's the sermon, not a bullet. A whole street full of nobodies turning out to be somebody. I'd rather you hear that than feel nothing ever again." Behind him, Marshal Burke came up at the street with the federal deputies. And it was over the way these things actually end, not with a great noise, but with handcuffs, and a corrupt sheriff named Hollis backing slowly into a doorway, and a land baron's whole architecture of forged paper. And bought silence coming down in the cold light while the river people watched. Della came and stood beside Roan. "You drew," she said quietly. "I drew," he said. "Once the right reason, far as I can tell one." He looked at her. "First time in 9 years I'm not sure I'll lie awake over." "You won't," she said, and took his hand. The federal hearing in Rawlins lasted 4 days. Della testified for 6 hours, across 2 sessions, and she did it in her own name and her own voice. Vane's lawyers tried the trick. Burke had warned of a hired killer's wife, a paper marriage, a mob, and Judge Harlan, who'd been working at Vane's Holdings for 2 years from the other end, listened to it once, and then asked the lawyers to confine themselves to the forgery, which they could not explain because there was no explaining it. One by one, the families came forward. This was the part Vane had bet against his whole life. The widow who spoke slow, the man with one arm, the family that had walked up out of the South, the old man whose grant was written in a language the court had to find someone to read. 2 hawks who'd been told his people's ground wasn't a claim at all. They came up, the frightened ones, and they said their names, and they said what had been taken, and afterward, not one of them looked frightened anymore. Saying a true thing out loud in a room that finally has to listen does something to a person. Della watched it happen 31 times. Roan testified for 2 hours. When the opposing lawyer asked his full name, the old one, the one he'd carried for 20 years, he said it clear and without flinching. Gospel Calloway. The move through the courtroom the way it always had, like weather. Men in the back row shifted, but it didn't break him, and it didn't break Della's case, because by then the room had already heard 31 true things, and one true name more only added to the weight on the right side of the scale. Judge Harlan asked him if his testimony was complete and truthful. "It is," Roan said. That was all the room ever got from him. It was enough. Cyrus Vane stood trial that winter on 11 counts of fraud, 2 of conspiracy, and once Pike and 3 other turned riders had finished talking 1 count of murder for John Hartley. The land baron lawyers, who'd made careers off his money, found other business to attend to. He sat through 6 days of testimony in a Cheyenne courtroom and listened, because the judge made him listen, while 31 deeds were read into the record and restored to the people they'd been stolen from. The jury was out 2 hours. They gave him 20 years in the federal penitentiary at Laramie. He was 61. Everyone in the room understood the arithmetic of that, Vane most of all. A patient man, finally given more time than he could use. He did not look patient when they led him out. He looked like what he was, an old man who'd spent his whole life certain the small people would stay small, hearing the door close on the day they didn't. Marcus Ellery, the doctor, broke before the trial even started. Faced with the exhumation order on John Hartley and the 3 other certificates he'd signed, he gave a full confession in exchange for not hanging, named the man, named the payments, named the nights. He lost his license and drew 15 years. Della sat in the gallery the day they sentenced. She did not say anything to him. She didn't need to. She had buried her husband twice now, once in a lie, and once, finally, in the truth, and the second burying was the one that let her stand up and walk out of that courtroom without the weight she'd carried in. Cole and the men he'd brought down from the North Ranch, the ones sent to clean house. The night Vane never got his chance were taken on the road 3 days after Casper Well. Burke had ridden out himself with deputies, 'cause he'd believed Pike, and because a lawman who lets a thing like that ride past isn't worth the badge. They found Cole's crew camped at a dry crossing, waiting on a signal from a man already in iron. Most of them surrendered when they understood the signal wasn't coming. 2 didn't, and were buried where the trail bent. The rest gave statements that put another nail in Vane's coffin and sent 2 territorial officials, men whose names had sat in the margins of Della's documents for 8 months, to a federal grand jury of their own. The rot, it turned out, went higher than one rancher. It usually does, but it had been pulled up by the root now, and roots don't grow back from nothing. That part wasn't finished the day the hearing closed. Justice rarely is. But it was moving, and it was moving in one direction, and for the first time in 8 months, Della wasn't the one pushing it alone. The verdict's first fruit came on federal letterhead, 31 deeds, reinstated, pending final confirmation. The Freeman, the Reyes Grant, honored at last by a country that hadn't written Greta's claim. Cap Doyle's, with a line struck through the clause about how fast a man had to work it. Two Hawks and his people, given background they'd held before there was a word for deed in this country at all. Della read the notice through twice, the way her father had taught her to read anything that mattered. Then she put her face in her hands for 30 seconds, just resting it there. Roan didn't move toward her or away. He just stayed, the way he was good at staying present and undemanding, the way something solid is present. He didn't go peaceful, she said. John, they let me believe it 3 years. Now you know the truth of it, Roan said. It's a harder thing to hold than the lie was, but it's yours now and it's real, and you can do something with a real thing. You can't do anything with a kind lie, except sleep through your own life. She nodded into her hand. Then she lifted her face and went back to work, because that was what her father had taught her, and what she'd taught a whole river. In the fall, Roan and Amos Freeman drove out to the Cimarron country together. They found the place. 11 years had grown grass back over the black ground, the way it does. They didn't say much. They set a small stone marker at the edge of where the cabin had stood, and Amos read out the one word they'd cut into it. Eli and Roan stood with his hat in his hands and let it cost him what it cost. Hattie said, "Carry it right," Amos said after. "Don't waste what it cost her." "I won't," Roan said. "I know," Amos said. "That's why I let you come." Two men stood a while in a field where a terrible thing had happened, and neither of them was the same man he'd been when it did, and that not forgetting, not erasing, but changing was the only kind of peace the thing would ever allow. They took it. It was enough. Della Hartley Calloway opened a land office on the north end of Casper Wells before the first snow. The sign said Hartley and Calloway Land Records and Claims, plain black letters, and it was open 6 days a week, and the people who came through the door were people who'd spent their whole lives believing the law was a thing built for somebody else. She taught them different, one deed at a time, one family at a time, the methodical way her father had taught her at a kitchen table with a survey map spread open, and a voice that said a person who understands what a deed says cannot be cheated out of what they're owed. She'd add the rest of it now, the part her father hadn't lived to learn. And when they try to tell you, the law doesn't reach people like us, she'd say, "You remember, it only stops reaching us the day we stop making it. The wall's only as high as the people too tired to climb it. Don't you get tired? Or if you do, lean on the rest of us a while and climb when you're able. That's the whole secret out here. We lean." Some of the people she taught went on to teach others. That was the part she hadn't planned and came to love. The most of things she'd started alone, carried now by hands she'd never have to lift. A widow in Douglas opened a second office the next spring. The route of that one ran straight back to a survey map on a kitchen table and a man who'd told his daughter she could not be cheated out of what she understood. On the first Friday of every month, a freight wagon came through on the Medicine Bow route. Roan Calloway drove it. He'd pull up outside the land office and climb down and go in. And Della would look up from her work, and he'd sit in the chair by the window, and they'd talk about the families, about the appeals still grinding through Cheyenne, sometimes about nothing at all, which was a different kind of talk, and in some ways, the better kind. He didn't stay long. He had a route, and a route had a schedule, and he was a man who kept what he committed to, but he always came back. That was the thing about Roan Calloway that Della had taken the longest to understand, and came to understand completely. He didn't stay because staying was easy. He stayed because he'd decided to. And with Roan, a decision made was a decision kept. The man the whole West had feared turned out to be most dangerous in the one thing nobody had ever counted: knowing when not to draw. And the woman they'd all bet was alone turned out to be defended hardest by the very people the world had thrown away. They'd both come a long way to be ordinary on a quiet river in Wyoming.
And in the end, this was never only a story about land or law or a gunman trying to outrun the name the West had given him. It was a story about what a person chooses to become after the world has tried to decide for them. Della Hartley began this journey as a woman everyone believed could be ignored. A widow, a school teacher, a lone rider carrying papers stitched inside a coat. Cyrus Vane looked at her and saw weakness and saw inconvenience. Even good men, at first, saw the problem before they saw the woman. But Della carried something stronger than a rifle. She carried truth, memory, and the names of people who had been pushed aside for too long. Her courage was not loud, it was not reckless. That keeps reading the deed twice, keeps riding when the road is dangerous, keeps standing when the room was built to make her sit down. Roan Calloway's lesson was different, but just as deep. He had spent years believing that the worst thing about him was the gun in his hand, when the harder truth was learning when not to use it. The world remembered him as gospel, a man as fast and deadly as weather. But redemption did not come to him through one more perfect shot. It came through restraint, through patience, through listening, through standing in front of the people he had once helped destroy and refusing to hide from what he had been. His bravery was not in drawing a gun. It was in telling the truth about himself and letting that truth cost him something. That is what real change asks of us. Not excuses, not forgetting, not pretending the past was smaller than it was. Real change asks us to face the full weight of what happened and then choose, again and again, not to become its servant. Even forgiveness gives this story one of its deepest meanings. She did not forgive Roan to free him from guilt. She forgave because hatred had already taken too much from her. She understood that forgiveness does not erase the wound, excuse the wrong, or return what was lost. It simply cuts the rope that ties another person's sin to your soul. That is not weakness. That is one of the strongest choices a human being can make. And the River families teach us the final lesson. People who are treated as small are not small when they stand together. A widow with slow English, a one-armed soldier, an old man with a deed written under another flag, a family that had already survived too much, and a woman everyone underestimated alone. Each of them could be broken. Together, they became a wall no land baron could climb over. The story reminds us that justice rarely arrives as thunder. Sometimes it arrives as a document filed on time, a voice speaking steadily in court, a neighbor raising a barn one board higher, a man choosing not to kill, a woman refusing to be silent, and a community leaning on one another until the powerful, finally, discover that the powerless were never powerless at all. The meaning of this story is simple, but it is not easy. Truth must be carried, courage must be practiced, and dignity must be defended not only for ourselves, but for those whose voices have been buried beneath fear. We are not defined only by what was taken from us, nor by the worst road we once walked. We are defined by what we do when the truth is finally in our hands. Della chose to fight with wisdom. Roan chose to live beyond his violence. Hattie chose freedom over hatred. The river people chose each other. And, because of those choices, stolen land was restored, buried lies were brought into daylight, and ordinary people became something extraordinary. When we leave this story behind, we should remember this. The strongest person is not always the one who strikes first. Sometimes the strongest person is the one who waits, watches, protects, speaks the truth, and refuses to let cruelty decide who they will become. And sometimes the greatest victory is not destroying your enemy, but proving that everything he believed about people was wrong.